start just at the very beginning. You come from a very intellectual home. Your father, your biological father, is also called the godfather of the neoconservative movement, and your mother is a well-known scholar and historian, and also a public intellectual, I would dare say. So if you just go back to those early days and describe how it was to grow up in that household.
Okay, well, first of all, let me say that how good it is to be here at Tikva, Israel, since have spent much time at Tikva, New York, and this is, of course, an equally important part of what Tikva does, and it's great to be here with Ron. I taught a class with him. I don't think we really taught a class. We led a seminar. Right? We learned from the other people in the seminar. I learned from the other people in the seminar. Ron taught the other people in the last week, so that was really a really terrific experience, actually. So it's been great to be here, and I'm going back tomorrow morning. So this is a wonderful way to end an Erev Hanukkah. So my parents were both intellectuals. My mother still is, but my mother was and is a professional historian. My father, a man of letters, as they used to say, or intellectual. He never liked the word intellectual, since I think he agrees with a lot of the criticisms of intellectuals. But nonetheless, I suppose that's a good term for him. I'd say one thing I learned, so growing up, but of course I had a normal childhood in New York, and insofar as anyone has a normal childhood in New York, and sports and other things. I would say the one thing I probably learned from them more than anything else, though, was that the majority of intellectuals or historians or enlightened people are often wrong. My father always swam against the tide a little bit. He was a liberal anti-communist and then it was called a neoconservative, was denounced for being not just a liberal anti-communist, but a neoconservative in the late 60s and early 70s, and he decided, might as well just accept the term. So he became a neoconservative, and then really more perhaps just a conservative. My mother was a historian who always, I think, didn't intend to, I think, but ended up leaning against the orthodoxy, the kind of liberal orthodoxy of academic historians in the United States, and for that matter, elsewhere also. So in both cases, I think I learned early a suspicion that even if everyone who was well educated or everyone who was an intellectual believed something, it could often be wrong.
Would you describe your house as more American, more Jewish, balanced? Did your parents lead you into the intellectual path that you eventually took?
No, I think actually I'll get back to the Jewish thing in a minute. No, when I finished college and I was admitted to both. I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, so I applied to both law school and graduate school. I was very interested in political philosophy. I'd studied that in college. So I was going to go on in political philosophy, but I also applied to law school, and I got into good law schools. And my father, the few times he ever really gave me much advice, or he said, I think you probably should go to law school. But I went to graduate school instead. my only real act of rebellion, I guess. And I can't say I really regret it. I very much enjoyed studying political philosophy in graduate school. So we were an American family of Jewish immigrants, very much like so many that many of you know or probably came from, actually, or know people who came from. My grandparents came over from Russia, Poland, from the Ukraine, from the Pale at the beginning of the 20th century. They were hardworking, working class types. My parents went to public university, to City College and Brooklyn College. And so they were the first generation to really make it into the middle class. So we were very proud Jews. My parents and grandparents were Zionists. My grandmother, I remember still as a little kid, she would go out and collect for the Jewish National Fund, with the tzedakah box. And I don't know if that ever happened. It probably doesn't happen here, does it? I don't know. But, I remember the blue tzedakah box. She would go to the local bank and sit there, really, and people would put in, a dime or a quarter. And so she was doing her best to help. And so my parents my mother had gone to the Jewish Theological Seminary, the conservative seminary, conservative with capital C, seminary, Masorti, I guess now it is in Israel, is that right? In New York. So she was well educated in Hebrew things. My uncle, Milton Himmelfarb, her older brother, really was well educated in Jewish and philosophy and history. My father had a real interest in it, always had an interest in religion, including Christianity, though he had read a lot of that as well. But, more theology, Barth, Rosenzweig, that sort of thing. And so there was a lot of interest in it. I was bar mitzvah. It was assumed that we were not observant at home. My father liked to say that he was a non-observant Orthodox Jew, but his sympathy was with the Orthodox, but not so sympathetic that he actually was going to be Shomer Shabbos or anything like that. So, and actually, this is funny. So we lived on the Upper West Side of New York, and for those of you who know New York, it's a very liberal area, and the Jews are very liberal, and the Reform and Conservative synagogues are very liberal, in their politics, and they often bring the politics into the services in a way my parents didn't like. So they were pretty relaxed about it, but I remember them suggesting, well, maybe I should go to an Orthodox synagogue for a bar mitzvah, even though we weren't observant, particularly at home. And indeed, I ended up going to the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue, which was just about half a mile from where we lived, which is this, it's Sheretz Yisrael. It's this grand, the oldest synagogue, maybe one of the two oldest synagogues in the United States, founded by the Dutch the Spanish and Portuguese Jews who came over from Holland in 1630s and 40s, very, very early, and had a grand Sephardi tradition. Many famous people had been members over the ages, and a very that kind of, I don't know if they have that here, but I mean, you have millions of Sephardi Jews, but this particular European Sephardi tradition was very, formal. You had to wear, for example, a top hat, if you were called up to the bima. So you couldn't, everyone wore kippah, obviously, and it was Orthodox, so the women were upstairs and so forth. But if you were going to have an aliyah, you had to have some form of top hat. And so I remember being bar mitzvah when I was 13 years old with the little, ridiculous-looking, hat. And so anyway, that was and I was interested in Judaism. I remember the '67 war vividly. I would have been, I guess, 14, so I was in the beginning of high school, and I remember my parents being very alarmed and worried, and me too, and then the great relief of what happened. And I think that was a sort of an important moment. And I would say in the late 60s, when the American left began to become anti-Israel, I guess, for the first time, I think. That was probably a little bit of why I rebelled. I often say that I rebelled against my generation, not against my parents. Most of my peers rebelled against their parents. They had liberal parents, then they became very liberal kids. I had moderately conservative parents. I became a little more conservative than them. But I really disliked, I've got to say, my peer. I mean, I got along with my friends, of course, and I liked school and had a good time and all, but I disliked the politics of my peers because I would have, in the late 60s, I was in high school. I went to college in 1970. This was the height of the 60s. And all the ridiculous pretensions of that generation that they had invented a whole new way of understanding everything, and they were going to change the world, and all for the better, and all the traditions should be thrown out. I didn't like that. So I actually think the 60s generation probably had as much to do, my rebelling against that had as much to do with my becoming conservative as my admiration for my parents, which also had something to do with it.
Okay, so let's move forward to the university. What year did you enter the?
So I went to Harvard in 1970 and thought I would study a little more. My father was editing a magazine called The Public Interest at this point. He had started it in 1965. It became quite well known as the center of neoconservatism, not foreign policy. This is the older neoconservatism. Skepticism. It was originally very social science, non-ideological, I would say. Studies of government programs. Do they work, And then quickly the studies started to show that a lot of them did not work. And so de facto the magazine became somewhat conservative. Not really ideologically conservative. Not, Hayek or Milton Friedman so much. But sort of just, here's a study of this big government program, and it has unanticipated consequences, and it doesn't work out well. And so that was the milieu. I'd sort of, I'd been reading those articles when I was in high school and not understanding much of all of them, but, that's kind of what I thought I would want to do. And there were some great professors at Harvard I studied with, James Q. Wilson, Edward Banfield, really great social scientists, a little economics I did. But I really fell in love with political philosophy. Harvey Mansfield was then, he's still going strong, but he was then a youngish tenured professor there. And he taught Plato, Aristotle, Machiavelli, Hobbes, Nietzsche, the usual kind of courses. And I really found that interesting. And so basically that's what I studied. I learned some languages because I understood that you had to know the original languages to really read these thinkers. And then, as I said, didn't go to law school and went on to grad school. So really from 1970 to 78, I guess, I was at Harvard and college and grad school. And my wife, whom I met as an undergraduate, which is very nice. We're still married. It's much easier if you. I recommend this to you all. It's kind of late, but yeah, it's much easier if you meet your wife or husband as an undergraduate, because then you avoid all that, angst of the 20s and 30s and dating, J-date, the whole thing. You can avoid all that. Anyway, that's useless advice, of course. You can give it to your children. Really, they'd love to hear it from you. The kids love hearing that from parents. Anyway, I met it only because she had gone to college. Susan had gone to college. Her father was a doctor, quite a distinguished doctor in New York, a neurologist. And she had gone as the oldest child, thinking she wanted to be a doctor too. She admired him, and she would have been a good doctor, actually. But she took classics in her, had taken a little in high school, I guess, and took it in college and really fell in love with that. So she was a classicist and ended up getting a PhD in classics, and I got a PhD in political philosophy. So we were really looked like we were going to be an academic couple, and we both got jobs actually at the University of Pennsylvania. It was hard. It is hard. I'm sure it's even harder here to get, especially if there are two of you, to get jobs at a university. But we were both lucky and got jobs at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, which is a good college in the United States. So that was at the end of the 70s, and I thought I would teach. And I taught history of political philosophy. My own field was a little more Locke, Montesquieu, the American founders, the effect, it was a little more practical, the effect of political philosophy on the modern liberal regime. But I really expected to be an academic at that point.
Since you were there in the 70s, this was after the 60s, and student rebellion, and also some faculty rebellion, right? So do you think you can detect a significant difference between the university today, as you look at it, from the faculty, looking at the faculty and the students, and what you had in the 70s, even just in Harvard?
Yes, I think it's really different. I mean, the rebellion happened in the late 60s. A lot of it really happened in the 70s, actually. I mean, the effects started to happen in the 70s because these things take time to move through institutions. So when I was at Harvard, there were a lot of, it was mostly liberal. And there were some not-so-great professors. In fact, there were a lot of not-so-great teachers because Harvard, like I'm sure it's true here at Hebrew University or Tel Aviv, put much more of a weight on research than on teaching. So a lot of the most famous professors were very bad or uninterested teachers and just came in and read their lectures. But there were some very good teachers. And it was mostly politically liberal. But the atmosphere was still free inquiry, liberal education. You were allowed to disagree in class. There really was a kind of old-fashioned liberalism, which has certain limitations ultimately, I think, but really believed in freedom of speech, freedom of inquiry, and also just in an education for education's sake. And I would say our son graduated from Harvard in 2009, so I have some, comparison here, and I have two daughters who went to other schools. And I do think that the left's march through the institutions has probably done the most damage to the universities. That's where they focused. That's where they get tenure. That's where they ended up being most intolerant, I would say. I mean, the kind of level of intolerance and closed-mindedness today, there's a lot of just silliness, but in a way that wouldn't matter so much. But the closed-mindedness and intolerance in the universities today, at least in the U.S., is really startling. And that was not the case. There was problems. Bill Buckley wrote a famous book way back in 1951, I think, God and Man at Yale, complaining about the Yale faculty. So it wasn't as if conservatives didn't have problems and criticisms of colleges and universities even before, but I do think it's much worse. And the quality has gone down in many ways too. Again, that was just a generation. There were still the immigrants from Germany and Europe from the 30s teaching at universities, and their students were teaching. So Mansfield was a student of Leo Strauss, for example, and there was a kind of old, high academic tradition, which was impressive, and which was still looked up to in the 70s, and they're all gone now, pretty much. Even their students are pretty much going, and now I think it's both more mediocre and more closed-minded. And as a result, I think, it's for those of us who care about helping young people read good books and think about interesting topics. I've decided really in recent years, and this is part of Tikva obviously, that a lot of what has to be done should be done outside the universities. The good news is that the only place to get an education is not a classroom, a college classroom, or university classroom. In this respect, I think the internet makes things easier to educate people outside the universities. And if you do a quick look through history, most of the real education that's ever happened has not happened in colleges and universities. And often, in fact, if you look at history, it's amazing how often in the 17th century, the Royal Society was set up in Britain. The 18th century, the Philosophe with the Encyclopédie, the encyclopedia, those were all done outside of the universities precisely because the universities were kind of captured at this time by the church, really, and were regarded as closed-minded by the Enlightenment thinkers. But it's amazing how, I think reformers and people who wanted to break the conventional wisdom, let's call it, at the time have often had to go around and outside the colleges and universities. And I really think that's the case today.
Let's go to government. Let's go to government.
Okay.
You worked
This is
in
making
the
me feel
Reagan.
very old, It's like Ron is so young, and he's like, what was it like back then, when did you have
Those days-
automobiles yet? Telephones,
Before I was born, way back. So you worked both in the Reagan administration and Bush. So just give us some tour de force of what did those administrations look like? What were your conclusions regarding government and United States policies from you spent time in education, right? In first under Reagan.
Yeah, so when I was teaching, I had gone to Penn, then I came back to Harvard to teach at the Kennedy School, and Bill Bennett, whom I knew slightly from various more academic circles, was nominated by President Reagan at the beginning of Reagan's second term to be Secretary of Education. And in America, you get a certain number of political appointments if you're a cabinet secretary, and he called me up and said, come work for a year, you'll write some speeches, and it'll be interesting, and you're supposed to be teaching government, so why don't you learn something about how it works? I had been involved a little bit in one or two campaigns, a campaign of Daniel Patrick Moynihan in 1976 for the Senate in New York. I took a summer off from grad school and worked for him. As a real little kid, I had done some, like handing out brochures, but I really hadn't done that much real government. And so we moved to Washington in '85, and I was there for the second half of Reagan, and then I became Vice President Quayle's Chief of Staff for the first President Bush. So that was in the White House. So that was interesting. It's hard to. I'd say one thing that's hard to capture today was the excitement of Reagan for Americans. If you were a conservative in America, if you had grown up reading National Review, or even after 1965, 6, 7, 8, commentary, The Public Interest, the Wall Street Journal editorial page, you were a critic of liberalism, but the Republicans who'd been elected, Eisenhower and then Nixon and then Ford, were very moderate in their politics. Nixon was a strong anti-communist, but in domestic politics, he went along with kind of the Great Society, the big government program. Then Carter was president. He was not even strong in foreign policy, unlike some of the earlier Democrats. So the degree to which the establishment thought Reagan couldn't win, Reagan was a right-wing, kind of almost crazy right-winger. He lost in '76. He was too old. He was going to be 69 in 1980. The election of Reagan was such a big moment if you were a young conservative of any kind, in America. And so the Reagan administration had these great hopes invested in it. Couldn't live up to all of them, though I think he lived up to some of the key ones. So it was exciting going there. There was a sense that I was very lucky in this way. I think it's fun to go to work in government anyway, and it's worth doing anyway, I think. But often you go and it's kind of a so-so administration, or it doesn't have that strong an agenda. There's no real self-identification. A lot of it is just jostling by different politicians. With Reagan, there was all of that, of course, with Reagan too, but with Reagan there was really a sense that you were part of the Reagan Revolution. People actually called it that. I don't know what the equivalent. Well, Reagan might have been that for the beginning in '77 or whatever that was, but that faded pretty quickly. I think the sense that this was really a new moment, a different party not just a party taking over, but a movement having a chance to govern. And so that was exciting, really. And I think when I look back at some of the things I said then, they were like very, not just militant, but sort of so hopeful that we could change everything. It looks a little naive in retrospect, but it's probably better to go into government thinking you can do more and then being disappointed than to go in sort of already jaded and cynical and not trying to do much at all. So I worked in the education department, which was a kind of second tier, of course, department, especially in the United States, because most education, almost all elementary and secondary education, is controlled by the state and local governments, so you just don't have much power. But Bill Bennett was a good spokesman. He made the case for reform, and so that was fun. We caused a certain amount of trouble. And then in the White House from 89 to 93, the Bush administration was a mixed bag, had some issues with Israel on the settlement and the loan guarantees. One of the things I did do, and I learned a lot about foreign policy then, was, so I worked for Dan Quayle, who was the vice president, he was a very bright young senator, had a horrible campaign. He was picked as vice president, next generation, Bush was older, had a terrible campaign. He wasn't really ready for it. They didn't help him much. He made some mistakes. And so by the time I went to work for him in 89, when he became vice president, he was regarded with some derision or not looked up to. And he was not very powerful, really, in the Bush White House. Good man, but we never succeeded, honestly, in fixing his image. This has always been I was his chief of staff. We worked on it. I think in the modern era, we might have had more success. With cable TV in America, Fox News, talk radio, the internet. Not because they would have been so nice to us, but because he would have had a chance to get out so much more. In the old days, if you had a bad image, they never saw you. There was no TV, cable TV to appear on. There was no talk radio. So, once people thought you were a dope, it was very hard to fix that impression. And vice president also is a very bad job to have because you're number two. You can't prove yourself. It's not like being a governor. So it was frustrating working for Quayle. I mean, not for me personally, but on his behalf, I was frustrated. But it was a very exciting time to be there. The Berlin, we took over in 89. I mean, if you had told us when we walked in to the White House in January 20th, 89, that the Berlin Wall would fall within that year, then if you had told us at the end of that year that Saddam Hussein would invade Kuwait in the middle of the next year and we'd have 500,000 troops in the Gulf by December of 90, I mean, these things all happen and you read about them in history books and it looks like they sort of were logical or expected. These were total, huge surprises. I mean, that is one thing I learned in government, that the degree to which the conventional wisdom is wrong, not because the conventional wisdom is stupid, but because just events happen and the world goes in funny directions. And things don't happen the way everyone expects them to, and is interesting. Anyway, but we did a pretty good job in foreign policy. Unfortunately, Bush, Scowcroft, Baker were not very pro-Israel. Quayle was very pro-Israel. And that was interesting, trying to, push a little bit behind the scenes, but, we had limits to what we could do. He was just the vice president. Jim Baker and Brent Scowcroft, who were extremely senior figures, did not think that they should be listening to me on anything, let alone Israel. It was a Republican administration. I was the most, and this is a difference, the Republican Party 25 years ago. I was the most senior Jewish staff member in the White House. And it wasn't, again, that anyone was anti-Jewish, really. It's just the Republican Party, people who had come in 10, 20, 30 years before and moved up to that level were not Jews if they were in the Republican Party. It meant that they regarded my pro-Israel position as more maybe, ethnic than based on analysis or whatever, so they sort of dismissed it. Quayle they dismissed. I remember in 91, 92, though, doing a lot of stuff that was not public, when there was this huge fight between Bush and Shamir on loan guarantees, you might remember, and Baker attacked the Israeli government. And it's one of the times I felt like I did a little bit. Most of the time the government, you don't make any difference at all. I felt like I did a little good, but the good I did was just making bad things less bad. But a lot of what you do in government is to make bad things less bad. So I actually worked very closely with Zalman Shoval, whom you might know or know of. He's still alive and well. I saw him a few months ago in Washington. Very fine ambassador, incidentally. I don't know if he ever got credit here for what he did in those years. I mean, very behind the scenes. It was still bad. The relations were bad, but he made it not a real crisis, and we tried to help him a little bit. So I learned something about the sort of behind the scenes side of government and of international relations. We traveled a lot. Quayle. The tradition in America is you send I guess it must be the same here with a deputy prime minister or something. You send the vice president to all the places no one else, the president doesn't want to go, the secretary of state doesn't want to go, funerals in various bizarre places. But still, it's interesting. If I was 30, whatever, when I was 35, 37 years old. So for me, I was chief of staff, having to arrange things with the chief of staff of heads of state. It was very exciting. They never let us go anywhere. We never went to Israel. We almost never went to Europe. Spent a lot of time on really boring, trade missions to Japan. That's my main memory. Opening up the Japanese auto market. It was like so boring. And the best trip, I'll tell one story. So we were in Indonesia. At the time, this is again 25 years ago, so Asia was not, Japan was big, but the idea that Asia was the new, all the activity was in Europe. The Berlin Wall fell. Would Germany be reunified? Would Germany be reunified as part of NATO? What would happen with Eastern Europe? Then there's Saddam invades Kuwait, so there's a huge amount of activity here. So that's where Jim Baker was, that's where Brent Scowcroft was, that's where the president was, and we were sort of doing other things. So we were in Indonesia on some trip, kind of pointless trip, just showing the flag, I suppose. And I got a phone call in the middle of the night from the president's chief of staff, which was kind of unusual on White House, phone, secure phone. This is pre-cell phone, or sort of pre-cell phone, but anyway, and I get awakened in my room in Indonesia, and I'm told Prime Minister Gandhi has just been assassinated in India. When is this? 91, I think. 90. It's somewhere around then. Anyway, any experts on Indian politics? Well, anyway, so and you're close by, so you're going to the funeral. Well, it turns out actually Indonesia is not that close to India, But if you're sitting in Washington, it's all the same, So like. And I think the Indian tradition is somewhat like the Jewish and Muslim tradition, and the funeral happens as quickly as possible, 24 hours or close to it. Maybe they gave an extra day because she was so head of state. But so we flew direct. I had to, and how presidential, even vice presidential trips, how complicated they are with security and logistics, and it's a big 80 people. It's not like you can just call up and take 2 rooms at the Hilton in New Delhi and show up. So it was an interesting challenge, but we got there. Remember, we left at 4 a.m. from Indonesia, went to India, and we're there for Mrs. Gandhi's funeral. We got there early, like at 10 a.m., and the funeral wasn't until, 3 p.m., and there was nothing so we went to the American ambassadors, and he was a good friend of the British ambassadors, as you would expect, and so they invited the people who were coming from Britain to come over to lunch, and so it was just like social, we're killing time till we go to the funeral. And I remember it was Prince Charles was the representative of the British government, so we got to have lunch with Prince Charles, and he was a flake, honestly, I gotta say. But anyway, seemed like a nice guy. And then we went to the funeral, and poor Vice President and Mrs. Quayle had to sit on the bank of the Ganges River for 4 hours while the body was burned on a raft in the middle of the river. And these Hindu priests they break the bones, so every now they go out there with these big hammers to make it, I guess, burn faster or something. And it was 104 degrees. And of course, we had a Secret Service car that had air conditioning. And I was just a staff person, so no one cared about me. So I sat in the Secret Service car and called back to Washington to report that the funeral was going great. Vice President Quayle was doing a great job representing the U.S., and they sat out there. It was really, and it went on and on. It was unbelievable. So that's my main memory of the vice presidential. Then we lost in '92, which was also an interesting experience. Bush won, so Reagan wins 2 elections. Bush wins his, unusually for America, the only time since World War II, the Republicans held the White House for a 3rd consecutive term in '88. Vice President Bush, though he had been behind, rallied to defeat Governor Dukakis. He wins, in effect, Reagan's 3rd term because Reagan was popular, the country was in very good economic shape, we were kind of winning the Cold War, and so Bush runs, as you would expect, Reagan's heir. He had been vice president for those 8 years, and wins pretty easily. I always like to say that the 4 years I was in the White House, Bush went from 54%, which is the vote he got in a 2-way race in 1988, to 38%, the vote he got in sort of a three-way race in '92 as Ross Perot runs. It's the biggest drop in American history for an incumbent president term to term, except for Herbert Hoover, who presided over the Great Depression. So that was my achievement there in government. But I knew we were going to lose. I was very pessimistic. I remember trying to warn people in the Bush White House. They didn't believe it. Bush thought he would win. The chief of staff thought he would win. In the era in which they had grown up of American politics, if you did a good job in foreign policy, if you did a good job on national security, and Bush had done a pretty good job except for his anti-Israel position, which ended up not mattering that much, really. You win, you keep the country safe, you defeat the Soviet Union, you kick Saddam out of the Gulf with not too many casualties. But Clinton saw that actually the victory in the Cold War, ironically, removed the necessity to have a strong president, a strong national security president. Clinton saw that. And I remember warning, I did see it. I would say this is one of the cases where I was a little bit more perceptive maybe than some of my colleagues. And I warned people in the White House. But another lesson I learned is people don't want to listen to you. They won't listen to you. People are very set in their ways. They want to believe that things will be fine. They don't like it when you say that things aren't great. I believe there are Greek myths that develop this theme about Cassandra and so forth at some length. No one likes someone who says we're in trouble. And so I tried to say we're in trouble. They didn't like me. But the one thing I was thinking about your election here, the one lesson I learned there is I would talk to people, just neighbors and people I knew I was in the White House. And I'd say, I voted for Reagan, I voted for Bush, but I think I'm going to vote for Clinton or Perot sometimes this time. And I'd say, why? I'd say, well, I'm just tired. 12 years of Reagan and Bush. We need a change. And I'd say, gee, really? You sure you want to do that? You got inexperienced governor of Arkansas. The world's still dangerous, and he's going to raise your taxes, and all the kind of obvious arguments. And it didn't matter. And I would say, speaking about the election, I don't know what's going to happen here, and I have no view. Honestly, it's very obviously complicated electoral politics here, but I am a little struck by the similarity of talking to a couple of cab drivers. This is my focus group, and one tour guide, all of whom just said sort of a version of that about Bibi, the degree to which it is dangerous politically when voters in a democracy decide they're just tired of you or tired of your party, and they can do things that seem irrational. It's always worth remembering, I'm a big believer in democracy and liberal democracy, but it's always worth remembering that Churchill lost a general election in May or June of 1945, the greatest statesman of the 20th century, who wins World War II. Really the most unbelievable demonstration, I would argue, of statesmanship in the 20th century, and is voted out by the electorate, 2 weeks before the war ends, I guess, right? Or a month before the war ends in Europe. It's really unbelievable, and and they were tired of the conservatives, who had, to be fair, had been in during appeasement, so it was the only way they could punish Chamberlain, was in a way by voting, ironically, against Churchill. But I did learn that lesson from the Bush years. Voters do have their sentiments, and sometimes you can make arguments it's too risky to go with the other guy, or he's done a pretty good job, really, if you step back and think about it. And I'd say if I were advising Bibi, which he hasn't called me to get my advice, shockingly, I would say he has to think hard about how to overcome that problem. People like us, I think, tend to underestimate it. We're interested in policies, we're interested in ideology, we're interested in, what's at stake. But a lot of voters have more of a, psychological kind of attitude in voting. So I learned that too in 1992. So we lost. We were all unemployed. I left the White House in January of '93, but I very much enjoyed my 7 years in government. And I always say to young people, and I found this myself, you learn a lot in government. It's worth going in, even if it's not the most perfect job, even if it's just for a year or two or three. You really have a different, I think, understanding of policy if you've been in government for a bit than if you haven't. I also found, in between Reagan and Bush, I ran a Senate campaign of my grad school roommate, a guy named Alan Keyes, who later went a little crazy, but anyway, he's a nice guy. Hopeless race, we lost. I learned a ton doing that too, and I do think being involved in, if you're interested in politics, being involved in campaigns, I don't know, here it might be a little different. In America we have 50 different state campaigns going on, or more, because they're governors and senators and congressmen. It's a little different than party lists. But it's really, you just learn a lot having to try to figure out how do you make a case to the voters. It's both. So I'm a big fan of working some in politics and working some in government, if that's what you want to be, the general area you want to be in. That was kind of a long answer, but
So we are over two careers, academic and in government, and now we come to the third. You found the Weekly Standard, and, which is you are still its editor in chief, right? So it's for 20 years. It's
Almost 20 years.
yeah. So where did that come from, and what did you learn from that?
It's another good case study of unanticipated consequences or kind of misunderstanding in a way. I mean, so we started the Weekly Standard in 1995. Fred Barnes and John Podhoretz and I. Fred Barnes had been at the New Republic, which was the most prestigious weekly journal in America, liberal, center-left. Krauthammer was with it at that point, and he was then a little more center, not really left, but center, let's say. Now he's more on the right. It was a small magazine, but very small in the sense of a circulation of maybe 80 or 100,000, which in the U.S. is small compared to Time, Newsweek, famous mass circulation magazines, but very influential. And the New Republic was also a liberal magazine that did criticize the left and criticize liberals on many issues. There was no real equivalent on the right. The National Review, which was Buckley's magazine, was a good magazine, but was in New York. It was every other week. It was a little more about conservative doctrine and a little less about reporting on what was happening in Congress and analyzing some issue that was breaking, And so we thought, and there were a lot of good young writers around at the time, conservatives, and so we started it. Now, the rationale for it, it's done fine. Today we have about 90,000 circulation, which is pretty paid print circulation, which is pretty high, given that, and it's as high as it's ever been, given that allegedly no one wants to pay for print anymore and everything is internet and all that. We have more readers, obviously, online than in print, though. So we're going in the same direction as everyone else. But luckily, we still can get some people to pay for the print edition, which keeps us going. New Republic has incidentally almost disappeared. It's now had a big crisis, so now it's down to 10 issues a year. It's not really a serious magazine anymore. So that's unfortunate, I think, for the country, because even though it had gone left in recent years, it was still better than having nothing, so to speak, on the center left. But then the internet came on. I remember this. So we set up the magazine in the summer of '95. The first issue came out Labor Day, which is the beginning of the school year in the U.S. It's September, first weekend of September. So I remember still having a discussion about how much money our library would cost, our research library would cost, because in those days, to have a magazine, you had to have encyclopedias and other research documents, because you'd have to fact check your articles, and some 24-year-old would have to be hired to look up and make sure the dates were right, and you'd have to have an archive of newspapers. Maybe you'd have it on microfilm if you were technologically advanced, and so we had the conference room was set up. I remember this still. We had a brilliant idea. We'll save money. We'll have a conference room where we can have our editorial meetings, 15 or 18 or 20 of us. And then along the wall, we'll have sort of a library, like a research room. And we bought a lot of it secondhand because some other magazines were going out of business and, that kind of thing. And, of course, 2 years later, we gave away all the stuff at the research library to some high school, I don't know, somewhere, because everything was online already and people were just sitting and looking up, Googling whatever the thing was. And Wikipedia had begun. And the idea of having a library was kind of ridiculous at a magazine. And so we ended up, one of the points of the magazine was to be a weekly and be on top of the news, but actually the internet kind of, ironically, sort of undercut that point. It still matters a little, but we adjusted, and we've, I think, had a good run. We've had developed a lot of good young writers. One good thing about editing a magazine, I'd say, and this is related to Tikva too, is you can say, well, we published this article by Bob Kagan, and this article by Ruel Marc-Gerecht, and this article by Lee Smith, and this book review by Paul Cantor, and these all became well-known and influential. And these 10 articles led to book contract. Chris Caldwell wrote 5 articles on Europe and immigrants, and then he wrote a very good book on Europe and so forth. David Brooks began at the Weekly Standard and wrote very interesting articles about Bobos and the new young professionals, and that became a famous book. But you can also say the influence is also indirect. People who worked at the Standard for a couple of years and moved on, articles at the Standard that led to other people researching things and writing books who weren't on the Weekly Standard staff, politicians who read something and thought, well, this is interesting. I should learn more about this. So I do think the indirect effect of a magazine can often be as great as the direct effect. And there are many people who got introduced through the Weekly Standard I'll give one example. Well, that is Chris Christie, who will be running for president, apparently wanted to. I was here, so I heard all this about this on email. Wanted to be briefed on what he should think about the CIA controversy about the waterboarding and so forth, and called actually had one of his staff people look at what the Weekly Standard had published, and then called up one of the authors who's not on our staff but is a contributor, and said, "Well, I read about you in the Weekly Standard." Or his staff said, "Governor read about you in the Weekly Standard. Come brief Governor Christie." So, I don't. That's the kind of influence a magazine can have. It's not direct. I didn't talk to Christie. Christie personally maybe didn't even read the article, but someone who came to someone's attention through the Weekly Standard hopefully gave a good briefing to someone who will have some influence in this debate. Anyway, we've done that for 20 years. That's been fun. I also got, shortly after we began that, I started doing some television. I became sort of a regular on the Sunday shows, which I'm not sure how it works here, but there are 3 or 4 really Sunday shows, which at the time were the sort of prestige TV discussion shows. They still are. I should say that since I'm still on them, but they're now so much more on cable that it's a little less special. It used to be that this was sort of the only show of the week where you'd have a discussion about, did Ted Cruz make a mistake or not, or what's happening with the CIA report. Now it's discussed endlessly, of course, so it's a little less special, but I still do that. And then I've had various other minor sort of side enterprises over the last 20 years as well. So it's been fun. I was in Washington, like here, you can do some writing and some editing, and you can, be involved in a couple of think tanks or activist organizations. You don't have to just do one thing.
So let's get to the present, and I'll utilize your academic knowledge, government experience, and acquaintance with politics as it is from the Weekly Standard. Do you think, as some of my conservative friends say, that the Obama administration has changed the political culture in America and government, and maybe also in the public itself?
I don't think so. Now, maybe that's my wishful thinking that I don't think so. I think he reflected a change. He certainly tried to advance various changes. I do think his failures, though, are important. I mean, a president can really change a political culture and even a broader culture if he wins, not just wins re-election himself, but wins by a big margin, if his party increases its margin in Congress, if there are a lot of younger people who get elected following in his footsteps. That would be the case with Roosevelt, and to some degree the case with Reagan. Really, with Obama, he personally won re-election, though with a smaller margin than he won election. But they lost, of course, the House in 2010 and the Senate in 2014. Republicans now have like 30 governorships and 2/3 of the state legislatures. It doesn't feel, like a wave of Obamaism is sweeping over the U.S. Now, whether in more subtle way, in fact, I would say the opposite. I mean, if you look around, in the 7 most competitive Senate races a month ago, of which Republicans won 6, the Republican candidate was the younger one in each contest. If you think of who are the bright, leave aside ideology, who are the bright, young, interesting figures in American politics? Rubio, Cruz, Scott Walker, or Jindal. Really, you wouldn't. There are almost no Democrats, you would say, who are in their 40s or early 50s. Christie's early 50s. The Democrats, think of the Democratic field, incidentally. It's going to be Hillary Clinton, who's I think 67, Elizabeth Warren, who's 65, Joe Biden, who's 73. So I don't think, it doesn't feel like politically Obama has succeeded in creating lots of imitators who are 30, 40, 50 years old. Now, whether in a more subtle way he's changed the culture or reflected a change in the culture, that could be. I don't think it's been entirely a healthy thing, but that will depend, I think. I mean, that's why I think it's a very important election in 2016, from my point of view. If the Democrats win a 3rd straight term, that would be deeply demoralizing, even if they don't win Congress, because Obama's been a pretty bad president, and his policies don't seem to be working very well, and you'd think the voters would therefore give a Republican a chance. If they're unwilling to, I think that would be demoralizing to conservatives, and very heartening to liberals, and it would be a big deal. It's rare that a party gets 3 straight terms in America. As I said, the only time it's happened since Roosevelt and Truman was with Reagan and Bush. So that would really, and Reagan is the most consequential president probably between Truman and today. So, it's not an accident that the important presidents get more, elect their successor. So that is why I think 2016 is a very important election for the future of the country. If a Republican gets elected, then it's like, well, Obama was a good candidate. He had a special appeal. He won 2 elections. He did change some things. He did some things. It'll take a while to reverse them. Maybe some of them will never be reversed. But it's less of a watershed moment, in American politics, I think.
Let's go domestic first.
Okay.
What do you think are if you were running the Republican campaign, what would you emphasize as Obama's failures? What are the 2, 3 most prominent examples?
I mean, Obamacare remains unpopular, and I think a conservative reform healthcare proposal that does fix some of the problems in the old system would be popular, and there will be such a proposal. A little group I'm involved in, has worked on one version of it. There are several versions. More broadly, I think the conservatives have to have a conservative reform agenda. It can't just be defending, the past. That's kind of pointless at this point. It has to be a fairly populist agenda. I would say the one thing I've probably moved on over the years, my father did this too, though. In theory, I'm not a populist. I think populism has got problems. But in practice, given how bad the elites are, I'm basically more of a populist. And I do think, especially for the Republican Party politically, it's so easy to make them unfairly, usually, but sometimes unfairly, to make them the party of the rich, the party of the Wall Street. The Republicans need to bend over backwards to be for middle America. So I would sacrifice even some free market orthodoxy, honestly, to help middle America. I would prefer to cut taxes on labor, for example, than on capital. Maybe some economists could show me that cutting taxes on capital would add an extra 0.1% to GDP. I'm not even sure that's the case today, honestly, since capital in America has done very well in the last 5 or 6 years, and labor has not done well. But I would still be for cutting taxes primarily on labor for political reasons. I mean, I just think people need to see the Republican Party cares about middle class America. So I'd be for a sort of pro-middle America, pro-middle class conservative reform agenda. I think there's a lot that could be done in education. The cost of higher education is insane. It's caused by bad government policies. So this is a case where deregulation would be both consistent with free market principles and actually politically very popular. And I think the same is true. I'd be sort of slightly anti-Wall Street, anti-crony capitalism, in the sense that Dodd-Frank, for example, which is our big financial services bill. It's incomprehensible to anyone. But basically, the big banks do fine. The little banks don't do well. So I said to a Republican congressman, giving an example of the problem, why don't you just, America, I don't know how it works here, but America has several famous big Citibank, Bank of America, so forth. Big banks, huge, national banks. It has many, many thousands of community banks, smaller banks, which service one area of a state, maybe sometimes a whole state. All these reforms were brought in after 2008, which was a huge crash, so they needed to be something, presumably. But they apply to the community banks, all these regulatory burdens. And I said to the prominent Republican congressman, well, just exempt the community banks from it. Community banks are all these small businessmen. They're mostly Republicans. They would love you. Their customers would like it. They would tell everyone that this was good. The community banks are not causing trouble for anyone. The community banks had nothing to do with the financial crisis of 2008. They're run on old-fashioned principles. There are still regulatory checks on them, of course. And no, this congressman said, we can't do that. We have to fix everything all at once. It's a classic. A, it was partly because they're close to the big banks, and they didn't want to give the smaller banks an advantage. But B, it's kind of overthinking. I see this a lot in politics. You can't fix this because you should fix everything, Then they don't fix anything, of course. And a lot of politics is finding symbolic things to do, not just symbolic, but real things to do that are also symbolic, that would show people that, hey, the Republicans did something that's good for the small banks and bad for Citibank and Goldman and so forth. But it's hard to get them to do that. I think they're moving in that direction. The good news is the Republicans. It's a big question whether they'll move far enough. And if Hillary Clinton's the nominee, she's totally in bed with Wall Street. And the Republicans have a chance to run a populist campaign like Reagan did. Not irresponsibly populist, but sort of soberly populist. We'll see if they do that.
Can you explain in 2 minutes the matter of immigration that has become a big deal? It will also be probably part of the campaign.
Yeah, immigration, so it's so complicated. But basically, we have 11 million people in America who are not there legally. Uh, Honestly, if you came down from Mars and looked at it, would you say it's a huge crisis? I don't know. It's in general not a good idea to have a lot of people who are not legal because they're not on the books. There are all kinds of inequities that obviously then develop about how they're treated, both inequities that favor them and inequities that disfavor them, actually, since hiring them is actually cheaper than hiring someone legally, who's here legally. Anyway, it's not a great situation. Is it a huge crisis? No. You could visit, most of you visited America. You walk around America, there's some, people who are working hard and aren't paying Social Security taxes and are off the books. There's a little bit more crime. Some of the kids go to school. Most of them become Americans. The kids do. The parents actually don't care that much. They want to make a living, send the money back to their families if their families didn't come in Central America or Mexico. They hope maybe one day to be citizens. It's sort of an issue that a bunch of So I think the best thing, honestly, is probably to do some small things and not try to fix it all at once. But the activists want them all legalized. Liberal public policy types love huge solutions, so they passed this ridiculous 1,200-page bill. Then the Republicans blocked it. The Republicans foolishly let themselves be painted as anti-Hispanic, which did hurt them in 2012. They've fixed that a little bit now, I think. But it's also an issue. Look, immigration is a good issue. We're a good case study. I guess most economists like free flow of capital and labor, but the truth is, in the real world, it does depress. It puts pressure on lower class, working class and middle class wages. I mean, that's just a fact. And I do think it's legitimate to say, well, wait a second, let's have a discussion. I mean, big business and big agriculture want more workers. And if you say, well, wait a second, can we just have a debate about should it be 1 million, 1.5 million, 2 million? You don't want infinite numbers, do you? No. Then this is a case where the left-wing elites and the right-wing elites, the liberal and conservative elites, gang up against middle America and won't even let you ask a question about, is this prudent? So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in 2016. But the political correctness on that issue is both conservative and liberal against a kind of middle American view that, also you don't want to have too many immigrants at once because it is a problem of assimilation. And you don't want to have huge numbers of one ethnic group in one part of the country not learning English and so forth. I think that problem's often exaggerated. America has such a huge propensity towards being a melting pot, towards assimilating, that we could assimilate an awful lot of people. And I'm still very optimistic about the Hispanics, incidentally. A third to a half of Latino, of Hispanic children marry non-Hispanics. So by definition, is this really going to be such a problem 30, 40 years from now? We do have but for good and ill, we have such a strong cultural push towards everyone becoming American that I still think that will solve a lot of the problem.
Okay, let's move on to foreign policy, and especially the Middle East. What do you think? How will the Obama administration be remembered in this region?
Everything's great, never been better. Well, I think it's a case that, look, Bush made some mistakes, and obviously the world is complicated, and we were talking about this before, some of us. Foreign policy, above all, is an area where often you have to make a tough judgment call. That's another thing I learned in government. There are some calls that are 80-20. You should easily do the right thing, it's obvious what the right policy is. There are other calls that honestly are very murky. They're 55-45. It's just unclear. No one knows what the future will hold. You make the right call, but then something else happens that makes it the wrong call later on. So I would say the invasion of Iraq was correct. But if you had told me that Obama was going to go in, take over, pull all of our troops out, be incredibly weak, and then do nothing when a civil war started in Syria that was going to spill over to Iraq, I guess I might have said, okay, maybe if we had known all that was going to happen, invading in the first place might have been a mistake. I still think it actually wouldn't have been a mistake because the idea of Saddam there with developing nuclear weapons in competition with Iran is a pretty horrifying thought, and the idea of his sons there, or the idea of we might have become a Syria anyway. I mean, who knows? But so I do think Obama's had a bad foreign policy, weak foreign policy, and I worry about that because I think we can fix most of the domestic stuff. We give up some economic growth over the last few years. That's not nothing. People are poorer than they should be. But at the end of the day, if you get the growth going again, most of the stuff will be okay. Foreign policy you can't really fix overnight. And I think some conservatives are actually kidding themselves a little bit they think it's like Reagan taking over from Carter. And that was a pretty abrupt reversal. And you could say that Reagan fixed most of, well, he didn't fix everything, since the Iranian Revolution of 1979 remains kind of a problem for the world and for you and for us. And that's one thing you can't fix. But Reagan did manage to get the country going in the right direction. The Soviet Union decided it couldn't compete. Gorbachev got won power, and everything else followed, really. But that was after 4 years of Carter. We'll have 8 years of Obama, 8 years of cutting defense, basically. And also Carter in his last year did reverse things. Carter, defense spending went up in 1980 under Carter. He toughened up against the Soviet Union. Obama's extremely stubborn, or he really believes in his worldview. And he seems disinclined to change it, even when reality should correct it. My father once said, a famous joke of his, that there was a lot of crime in the 60s and 70s. People were being mugged. You know, what is that word in Hebrew? Is it people know it, right? Yeah, if you're mugged by a criminal. So my father once said, a neoconservative is a liberal who's been mugged by reality. You know, that all these liberals had nice ideas, and then they walked down the street and someone mugged them, and they decided, you know what, having more police is not such a bad thing. So Oslo was the great example, after the Intifada in 2002. That was like mugged by reality, and a lot on the Israeli left, I think, changed their mind, and they didn't, maybe they realized that something they hoped could happen wasn't going to happen. A young friend of my father's, a couple of years later, who's unfortunately died quite young, Mike Scully, there were a lot of liberals then who said, "Oh, we also learned the lessons of the Great Society. We're not stupid naive liberals like in the old days, but we're more sophisticated liberals. But we're still liberals, but we just have figured out a better way to do it. We're not. We know there's not going to be. I guess the Israeli equivalent would be. We know there's not going to be a new Middle East, but still we think we can work out some kind of more or less ambitious peace process or something. And but there were all these liberals in the early '80s in America, and Mike Scully said, they called themselves neoliberals. A neoliberal is a liberal who's been mugged by reality and refuses to press charges. You know what press charges? Yeah, what the district attorney does. And I think that's a very deep insight. Many people in politics get mugged by reality, but then they don't really want to think about the consequences. They don't want to press charges. They want to still believe what they believed. And so they work out a way. Churchill has a line about this, I think. He's found in life, Churchill said, people have an amazing ability to stumble over the truth and pick themselves up and go right on walking. And that's one thing I've learned over the years. How did I get into this foreign policy? Yeah, so and I think that's very true of Obama. He just has a strong worldview. He gave the Cairo speech. Look, he gave that speech. That was the speech they worked on the most. It was in June, I think, of 2009. And that was his vision. And it was not a ignoble vision. I mean, if it could have happened, it would have been nice. You read it now, and it's just ridiculous. It just seems like a joke almost. And yet he fundamentally has not really gone back on any of it. He's got a very stubborn ideological view. He's got 2 more years in office. I do think he can do some damage. I think a Republican Congress could help, maybe reverse defense spending, maybe prevent a bad deal with Iran, though that's very hard. An American president has a lot of power. Dan Shapiro, the American ambassador to Israel, gave a speech, I think, at the Begin Sadat Center just a week ago, in which he warned the Israelis not to hope too much that the Republican Congress would stop them would save them from the president. He said presidents can often do in their last 2 years kind of what they want, regardless of Congress. And to be fair, I mean, Bush did do the surge after losing the 2006 election to the Democrats when the war was unpopular, and he just thought it was the right thing to do and did it, and I supported him. And so I don't object to presidents trying to do the right thing, but I do think Obama, the weakness is really dangerous. I mean, the combination of the psychological weakness, the political weakness, this cutting of defense spending, I think you put it all together, and if you're Putin, if you're Assad, if you're Khamenei, you just look at America and you think it's not fearful. There's nothing to be scared of. If you're an ally, you think, will they be there? I'll tell one story, which I guess maybe we shouldn't repeat. Whatever, it doesn't matter. So I was in Japan in November of 2013, a year ago exactly, November of 2013, with about 4 other people from foreign policy think tanks, and it was, some think tank paid for us to fly to Japan and meet people there to strengthen the U.S.-Japanese relationship. I mean, I really don't know much about Japan. I'd last been there 20 years before when I was in government with Korea, and I thought it'd be interesting. So flew over there. So they arranged nice meetings for us, and we actually had a meeting with Abe, who just, I see, got reelected by a huge margin in his sample election. So we had a meeting with the Prime Minister. And we had been briefed a little bit and about what to talk about, and the other people with me knew more than I did, but I guess I was the most senior person, so it was like this. They sat in all these meetings are with, it must be the same here, right? The Prime Minister or the President sits with the, other head of state. But when it's just a bunch of people from a think tank, whoever's the most senior person gets to sit as if he's like the other head of state. So ridiculously, Abe was here, I was here, the translator was here, and the photographers came in. I think they were pretending to the Japanese that this was a very important meeting of Prime Minister Abe. Distinguished American thinkers meet with our Prime Minister. It was like ludicrous. So they took some photos, Then they left. And I started, I think this is the appropriate protocol. I turned and I said, Mr. Prime Minister, thank you so much for taking time from your busy schedule to see us. It's the usual thing. I really look forward to talking with you about the U.S.-Japan relationship and issues in the South China Sea. And Abe had a translator. He speaks, obviously, when he's meeting with foreign leaders or anyone important, he speaks with a translator. But he actually knows English pretty well. Fairly well. And so he actually interrupted me in English and said, Mr. Kristol, could I interrupt you for a second? And I said, yeah, well, yes, Mr. Prime Minister. It's your office. And he said, can I ask you a question first before we talk about this? And I said, absolutely. And he said, what happened in Syria? And I actually didn't understand him at first. His English isn't that good. And, Japanese accent's a little hard to understand. And Syria was so out of context. So I was thinking to myself, I was trying to remember the little briefing we'd gotten on the, the islands, what are they called near there, that they're fighting with the Chinese about. And, maybe he's going to ask me something I don't know anything about, and I'll give it to my colleague to answer, And then I realized he asked about Syria. And I said, well, here's what I think happened. Obama said red line, but he didn't really want to do it. And then he backed off when there was opposition. And I said, but are you really concerned about that? He said, absolutely. He said, the most important thing that has happened for U.S. policy in Asia all year was the red line in Syria, which your president didn't enforce. The Chinese saw it and immediately stepped up their provocations. We saw it and worried we have a defense treaty with you. What's going to happen? The Philippines saw it, Australia, Indonesia, India. He had just come from a meeting, I think, with a lot of the Asian countries. And I said, actually, I tried to reassure him, and I did tell him what I think is true, which is whatever Obama's problem is, he's not going to give up the U.S.-Japan defense relationship, so he probably is Syria is one thing, but Japan's another, and we do have a formal treaty. It's a little more serious. But it just struck me how much, how contagious around the world a view of weakness is, and how what you do in one part of the world has repercussions elsewhere. And I do worry very much about our foreign policy and the whole of the next president. The next president's going to take over in January of 2017, and some of it, if he's just run on a campaign platform of a strong America, some of it will take care of itself. People will say, oh, America's changed, new leadership, But some of it, the actual defense budget and some other policy matters, it's going to be tough for the next president. And of course, some things you just can't reverse. If Iran gets nuclear weapons, then we're in a whole new world, which is why I've been focused on doing what I can to try to encourage people in Congress to make it harder for President Obama to cut a bad deal or to do nothing about Iran. So I do think foreign policy has become much more of an issue than anyone expected a year or two ago, which is good. It'll be a part of the debate in 2016. I think it's going to be hard for Hillary Clinton to explain why should she be elected president when she was Obama's Secretary of State. The good news for me on the Republican side is that the Republican Party is, in my view, a pretty good party on foreign policy. It's pro-Israel, it's pro-internationalist, it's pro-American strength. Rand Paul, I think, will not do well. He probably won't do any better than his father. The whole Pat Buchanan wing is almost non-existent. The Bush-Baker-Scowcroft wing is really not much to be seen. One of the underreported stories of American politics is the triumph of Reaganism in foreign policy among Republicans and conservatives. And some of it's due to, I think some of us who fought this fight at the level of magazines and opinion leaders. A lot of it's just due to the American people who, I think instinctively on the conservative side, don't like the idea that, ISIS is rampaging through the Middle East and Putin is invading Ukraine and we're doing nothing, they have an instinctive sense that if we don't do something or stand for something or stand with allies, that the world will get extremely dangerous. In that respect, 9/11, I think, was a big moment and still resonates with people. So I'm fairly optimistic in general about the American public, but I am just worried, practically speaking, that you could be in a very big, the next president could find himself in a very big foreign policy hole.
So my last question, and then we'll open it up a little. What advice would you give to the coming Israeli prime ministers who will have still more than a year and a half of the Obama administration with nothing to lose, just doing whatever they want?
I mean, I think it's very hard for, the prime minister of all allies, smaller allies, especially Israel, though, which is so, for whom the United States is not only the biggest ally, but one of the few really staunch allies, to manage that. And I honestly, I think looking from afar, I think Bibi has done a pretty good job. I mean, he's maybe made a few more concessions than some people would want. At other times, he's maybe unnecessarily provoked Obama. But basically, he strikes me as having done a pretty good balancing act, standing up for core Israeli interests when necessary. I do think the Congress is very pro-Israel, so there's an opportunity to go over Obama's head somewhat. But I don't think anyone should kid, no matter who, if Herzog or Livni or whoever's the new prime minister, relations with Obama will not be very good. I mean, Obama has a view of the Middle East that is not like a labor view as opposed to a Likud view. It's like I don't know if it's a Meretz view or it's slightly beyond that, probably, honestly. And it's his view. I mean, I don't think it's malevolent exactly. It's just a very bad view that he's at. I would put it this way: Obama's dream, I believe this is true, when he was elected president, if you'd said, what 4 or 5 things would you really want to do? Obviously, he'd want to be symbolically just, I think the first African-American president, a success, and very important for race relations in the U.S. I'm not sure, unfortunately. And I thought that might actually be something he could accomplish. I'm afraid that's not been I don't think that historians will say that he did much good on that front. I think Obamacare was obviously a huge goal of his, and general expansion of the welfare state in a European direction. I think in foreign policy, probably the 3 things he really wanted were new opening to the Muslim world. That's the Cairo speech. It looks a little ridiculous now. A reversal with Iran. That's, I think, always been in his mind. Nixon goes to China, a moment where and he still thinks he would, believe me, he is thinking he would love to go to Tehran. He loves the idea of going to Tehran in 2016 with a deal with the mullahs, and he can say, I've finally ended 35 years of hostility, and it's a new moment, and so forth. I think that's very dangerous, since I don't believe it will be a new moment. And the third would be he wanted to be the president who presided at the creation of a Palestinian state. And I don't think I think he honestly thought, there'll be an Israeli state. It won't be quite as big as the Israelis like, but there'll also be a Palestinian state, and surely we can work this out. And in any case, it's really important morally, and it's important for America to be on the side of the Palestinians. He had all these friends who told him this over the years. So that's a deep instinct of it. Now, presumably, he knows it is not going to happen in the next year and a half or the next 2 years, no matter who wins the election here, But I don't know. People can kid themselves. So I'd be a little worried about, after the election, a renewal of pressure on Israel. I would say this is not a reason for Israelis to vote one way or the other, but it's a fact. If Bibi wins, or some coalition on the right, center right wins, I think even Obama's going to kind of just give up. And now he may do some bad things, like threaten not to veto stuff at the UN, but I don't think he's actually going to think he can persuade the new Israeli government of anything. The danger, I would say, is if the center left wins, he will misinterpret that. I mean, he will think that they are running on an Obama platform, which I don't think they really are. And he will then, you could imagine a huge effort to take advantage of in America, the repudiation of Bibi would be viewed as a repudiation of hawkishness, a repudiation of settlements, and so forth. And I do think that could encourage Obama, actually, to then think he can accomplish something, which will turn out that he won't be able to accomplish, but could lead to more friction with Israel. But basically, Israel should expect some friction for the next 2 years, and should probably do what it has to do in terms of security. And the good news is, I don't know, most Americans are pro-Israel. The ones who are anti-Israel are anti-Israel regardless of how many apartment buildings go up in North Jerusalem or how many, extensions are built onto houses in Kfar Adumim or anywhere else. I just think it's Israel should do what it thinks is the right thing and probably not worry so much about America, and also honestly work with other countries. I mean, I'll make this my last point since I've gone on too long. From a certain point of view, for a conservative, the tragedy of the moment is we probably have the best conservative prime ministers ever in the English-speaking countries. Bibi here in Israel is an impressive guy. Harper in Canada is fantastic. And Abbott in Australia is really impressive. And if only we actually, and even Cameron in England and Britain isn't great, but he's at least more conservative than the last 15 years. And so the only place that doesn't have, in the English-speaking world, that doesn't have, if they actually got together, if we had a conservative, moderately conservative American president, you could actually do something with these partners. And incidentally, Modi in India, you could argue, right? So, I mean, it's actually terrible that we have Obama when finally, I remember all those years I was in government. Canada had, Trudeau, and Australia had Labour governments, and they were all problematic, and, from a conservative point of view, and they didn't want to join us in various efforts. And now we have people who are more hawkish than we are, and more pro-American than the American president, so...
Questions?
Mr. Kristol, thank you for your words. We'd like to ask from a more, philosophical perspective, you might maybe analyze the phenomenon of Tea Party in the Republican Party. As a conservative, maybe. It's interesting for me to hear what's your opinion about it.
No, I would say, two big things happened in America, and they were both predictable in a way after a difficult war and then the collapse of '08. Populist movements on both the left and right, anti-establishment movements. Obama was the movement on the left. He defeated Clinton. It's the first time an insurgent challenger has beat the front-running candidate in America, really in about 25 years in American politics, And I think it was because she had voted for Iraq, and so the left wing wanted someone more radical. And then Obama becomes president, and the same thing happens on the right, which is really the Tea Party was the conservatives' version of the Obama movement. And they were quite similar. I mean, the Obama movement was more young people and whatnot, but both had an upsurge of turnout. Both led to overturning some of the established figures in the parties. The good news in America, I think generally, is that these insurgent movements, because we have a federal system and a decentralized system and a state and local election system, which maybe you all should think about since your system, I've got to say, having watched it for the last week, it's really nuts over here. These coalitions with, national lists. Anyway. But in America, the good news is the Tea Party, I think it's good news, really, doesn't become, as it often does in Europe, a third or fourth party, Le Pen or whatever, which can become a little crazy. It gets absorbed. It challenges people in the Republican Party. Marco Rubio runs against the former governor of Florida. Ted Cruz runs against the lieutenant governor of Texas. They beat them in primaries, and now they're part of the party. So they're now the more populist, conservative part of the party. I'm on the whole pro-Tea Party. I think it's been healthy. They have a few people went off the rails. They lost a few races they should have won. But if you ask me, would I prefer a Republican Party that looks like the Republican Party of Bush, McCain, Romney, Dole, was full of establishment, Chamber of Commerce figures, or a Republican Party with a lot of youth, vigor, a little bit of wackiness occasionally, a little bit of imprudence, but basically heart in the right place, I would say. I kind of like so I think the fights are now much less. There are now many gradations too, and so it's become a little bit of a catch-all, the term, But on the whole, I'm slightly, I think it's been a healthy thing. And I think from the point of view of the system, you've got the sort of Obama forces in the Democratic Party. Then there was Occupy Wall Street, and then Elizabeth Warren, and that's all fine. I don't agree with them, but they're entitled to make their case in the Democratic Party. And similarly, the more populist conservatives are entitled to make their case in the Republican. And I do think, look, the establishment Republicans have never come to grips with this fact. The biggest financial collapse in 70 years, 80 years, I guess, happened when Bush was president. And there were Democrats that won Congress in '06, but most of that time there was a Republican Congress. Now, I can say it was due to liberal policies. It was due to Fannie and Freddie. It was due to Barney Frank. There are many complicated arguments about what it was due to. It wasn't really due. The liberal narrative is kind of misleading. Still, he was president. He told us everything was fine. Henry Paulson was Secretary of the Treasury, this big shot from Goldman Sachs. The Republicans had controlled Congress most of these years. And you've got to expect that voters are not going to love the Republican establishment after the scariest thing that happened to middle-class America in 60 years had happened on a Republican watch. And so the Tea Party was almost inevitable, I would say. And it's kind of healthy. And I kind of wish the Republicans would be more critical sometimes of, and the big business in Wall Street. The truth is, really, since the '08 crash, stocks are up 100%. Capital has done very well. Businesses have done very well. And working families have been very stagnant. So you would expect a kind of populist reaction. In a way, the miracle is it's been a pretty healthy populist reaction. It's not really xenophobic. It's not a protectionist particularly. It's not crazy. It's a little more conservative on some of those issues. And mostly it's sort of, can't we get back to the Constitution? Can't we limit government? Can't we not have ridiculous, huge, failed government programs? It's not a bad set of views from my point of view.
Thank you again. With regards to Obama's policy in the Middle East, to what extent, first, do you think it may have anything to do with his quasi-religious beliefs, Jeremiah Wright, and emotional baggage, Michelle, his wife, who apparently from her days in college was extremely anti-Israel. I don't know if it's true or not. If it is the case, what could a country like Israel do where the issues are not only logical or practical?
No, I don't think it has much to do with that. It has a lot to do with the dominant views among liberal academics when President Obama and Mrs. Obama went to college. But you don't have to have grown, believe me, there are plenty of academics who have these views about Israel who didn't grow up part-time in Indonesia. The Jeremiah Wright thing was just Obama trying to get himself established in Chicago. He didn't believe any of that. I mean, for better or worse, I think it was more cynical than that he loved Jeremiah Wright. Jeremiah Wright was an extremely popular left-wing preacher who would help Obama get started in Chicago. Michelle, I don't even know. She's a middle class. Her parents were hardworking middle class African Americans. She went to Princeton. Most people like that get a little radicalized sometimes. I mean, this is unfortunately the case in America. The academics encourage you to be interested in the politics of grievance. I'm sure she had anti-Israel professors at Princeton, but so did everyone else. But I mean, look, the bad news is it's not just Obama. I mean, Mrs. Clinton is probably a little more pro-Israel, though I will remind you that the person who had the total fit when the Netanyahu government literally gave a tender for an apartment building it was in North Jerusalem, right? It wasn't even outside of the actual city. That was Mrs. Clinton in 2009. And John Kerry did not have any of these issues when he was growing up, and he's obsessed with the peace process. And a lot of Americans on the left the American left has become fairly anti-Israel. Some of the American left has become virulently anti-Israel. About half the Democratic Party, I would say, is not pro-Israel. Obama's probably a little worse, than some of the others, but I'm afraid it's not an exception. And Mrs. Clinton might be a little bit of an exception. She's an older generation, literally, of Democrat. But I don't think you're going to have. It's not going to be as bad as the Labor Party, or as the French left, or as the German left. But I think you're going to have to get used to the fact that one of the two major parties in America is divided on Israel, at least, and not reliable on Israel. And I say that as a Republican, I'm happy to say that in the sense that we're more pro-Israel, but it's bad for America and it's bad for Israel. We shouldn't kid ourselves, but I think it's probably a fact for a while. So the kind of Palestinian narrative and all that's so deep in the American Academy that I don't think you can really ascribe it just to his upbringing or something like that.
Okay, last question, Dan.
There's a sense in Israel, there's a sense, I think, in the world, and anyone who's looking at Israeli politics, that actually Israelis are moving more to the right on settlement issues, on the issue of the Palestinian state, and on all of these issues. And I feel that even the Republican Party isn't there. The Republican Party, at least according to what it says, believes in the Palestinian state, opposes settlements, and I want to ask.
That's not true on settlements.
Okay. My question basically is, these these disagreements are still going to exist, at least in theory, when please God, the Republicans are back in power in the States. So my question is, do you think that tension is also going to exist then, or that it's actually going to get better? I mean, the disagreements aren't necessarily based on emotional stuff. There's also clear disagreements, and I'll let you answer.
No, it's a good question. I'd make a couple of points. A, there were always disagreements. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. I was there in 91, 92, and there was a pretty fierce disagreement. That was a more pro-Arabist, you might say, old-fashioned Republican administration. But obviously Johnson, let's go back through history. Are we happy about 1956 and Eisenhower? Are we happy about Johnson in the run-up to the war of 67? Are we happy about Nixon turned out, who didn't like Jews that much, but Nixon turned out to be the best friend, in my opinion, Israel ever had in the White House, probably, because he overrode his own administration to get the aid here in 73. But a lot of people didn't want to send the aid, even when Israel was genuinely in peril. Obviously, there was the agonizing reappraisal, even Reagan in 81, 82 with Lebanon. So, one can overdo the golden years. I'm not saying you were, but one can generally overdo the notion that there was a golden era of the past where Americans and Israelis were lockstep. That's not true. The Jewish community in America used to be more pro-Israel. That's a whole different topic. And as I like to say, thank God for the Christians. That's the main thing, Look, the American Republicans are a little. Honestly, I'm not sure if the Republican Party isn't to the right of Likud right now. And I don't mean that ironically. I mean literally. If you asked a Republican politician what their position was on the territories, on even the two-state solution, everyone's so used to saying it that Republicans say it too. But of course, why would you have to be crazy? Republicans are not going to be more pro-Israel than the government of Israel generally. But I would say if you got it in a room privately, they would be totally skeptical of it, just as I assume privately many senior people in the Likud government would be skeptical. But I sat there with Bogi Ya'alon when he spoke. He was in Washington about a month ago, and Ron Dermer had 40 people over for a dinner, and people from the administration, conservatives, liberals, and we all listened to him talk, And I remember thinking at the time, he sounds like a typical Republican, talking about the Middle East, about Israel, but no more conservative or hawkish. And in some ways, here you still have to be a little more polite, probably, about some of those things. And so I honestly, I think if there's a Republican administration, it's likely to be a strongly pro-Israel administration. Now, look, we have many things going on in the world. We need the cooperation of other states. There could be times when a Republican president will get annoyed at an Israeli prime minister for messing up a different diplomatic initiative. The good news for Israel, though, I think, is in the old days there was real tension. The Republicans were pro-Saudi, pro-Jordan, pro-Sunni Arab, and therefore there was a tension between that and being pro-Israel. Now, it's all the same. So far as I can tell, it's pretty much the same thing. So, that is to say, Israel's got good relations with these countries. The Republicans want to support those countries, basically. So I may be missing a few elements where there could be annoyance and, some tension, but I honestly don't think there'd be much difference. I don't think Republican Party is going to stand up and when the Prime Minister of Israel says he's for a two-state solution to say, no, we're for a one-state solution. I don't think that's going to happen. But de facto, would the Republicans put much pressure on? And I don't think so. And I honestly think that I'd say the U.S. government as a whole, if there's a Republican president, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, and all that, will be more to the right than the Israeli government as a whole. When members of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, when Israeli, people come over to Washington, I hear this from my Republican friends, who are pro-Israel. They had a meeting, and the person from Israel was telling them all the terrible things that Israel's doing, and maybe you could put a little pressure on, to stop this. And the Republicans think, I don't know, I didn't think that was a big problem that they, did this. So I'm pretty optimistic about the Republicans. It is a problem that half the Democrats are not pro-Israel. And the U.S. Academy, the U.S. universities, to get back to one of the things we talked about very early, are really bad. That's a kind of European influence. It's a Palestinian narrative. It's a third world narrative. It's a whole bunch of things going on at once. And we could do a better job, and I think we'll try to work on this, at fighting that, I think, among young people. And then the American Jewish community is just still so attached to liberalism, at least a good chunk of it, the part that's least attached to Israel and the part that's least attached to Judaism. But that's a lot of American Jews. And it's a big mistake, a final point. One problem is, if I were an Israeli prime minister, I would not privilege the American Jewish community at all over the rest of Americans in discussing Israel. Now, obviously, Jews are in some way, as the state of the Jewish people, Jews everywhere have a kind of privileged status, you might say, as interlocutors with Israel, and of course they have the right of return, so it's complicated what I'm saying, maybe I'm overstating it. But I really think it's a mistake to address, I wouldn't speak any more to the American Jewish community than to the American Christian community or the secular Americans. I would just treat Americans are Americans. Israel should make its case. Dermer's done a very good job of this. They should make their case to all Americans. They should make a case that's intelligible to all Americans. And all the ethnic special attention, not ethnic, all the special attention to the American Jewish community has become counterproductive. Because the American Jewish community is full of liberals who think they want to get along with their even more liberal friends back home. And so they come over to, they want to always be a little bit more liberal than the Israeli government, and they want to show that they don't approve of this nasty thing that happened. And it's very bad. And really, I think, in a way, a more realpolitik, a more hard-headed attitude towards America in general. America's a good friend of Israel. Speak to Americans as Americans, and just American Jews are just a part of America. That would be my slightly perverse advice to the next Israeli prime minister. Ignore the American Jews.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to end with 3 short notes. One, in relation to the coming Hanukkah, you have to remember that, contrary to the Jewish narrative, we did not fight the Greeks. Second, I wish you all a very happy Hanukkah, Chag Sameach. And third, I would like to really thank you, Bill, very much.
Chag Sameach.